Hi, Joseph.
Hey, Philip.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Welcome to meaningoflife.tv.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, yes. Let me introduce us. I am Philip Menchaca, and you are Joseph Baker, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at East Tennessee State University. And you are also a Senior Research Associate for the Association of Religion Data Archives, the author of Paranormal America, and the co-author of the book we're going to discuss today, which is right here, American Secularism. And as listeners may gather, we are going to be discussing secularism in America and some of its links to politics, and what it means to be secular, and some of the trends in secularism in the United States over the past decade or so. I want to start though with getting your thoughts on a claim that is frequently made about the United States, and I want to, what do you think about the idea that the U.S. is a Christian nation?
Oh, right. Yeah. This is. Oh, well. There's a couple of ways to look at this. One is that historically, that has not been the case, at least in the sense of an established religion. Now, some states, specific states, had established religions, so it wasn't true. But it's not true in the sort of the grand sense of having an established Christendom. Um, Now, certainly, lots of people have long thought that the U.S. is a Christian nation and tried to act accordingly. Um, but really, the U.S. is a very religiously diverse nation and always has been. There's the reality of sort of the religious pluralism of it, but then there's also this sort of strain of ideology that tries to say that the U.S. is a Christian nation is almost like a political claim. This is actually really influential now. This is not in the book we're talking about, but I've done some research showing that the strongest religious predictor of voting for Donald Trump in the most recent presidential election was Christian nationalism. So,
Mm.
like how people thought about a range of things about whether religion should be in the public sphere or whether explicitly saying the U.S. is a Christian nation. So, the Christian nationalism claim is influential, and it's important to understand it. But historically, it's not true in the sense of establishment, and practically in terms of numbers. The U.S. has always been a very diverse nation, and even now, a lot of times when people talk about the U.S. as a Christian nation, they reference sort of this mythical past. But historians who study, the religion of the U.S. in colonial times will say it wasn't actually that pious then either, and it was pretty diverse, and there were different types of religions going on, and so it's more mythology than fact in terms of history, but it's an influential myth, is what I would say.
Interesting. I wasn't planning on getting into this, but since you bring it up,
Here we
the
are.
Donald Trump question, I'm curious.
How can you avoid it?
How can you avoid it? That's an interesting statistic. Did you happen to? How did you gather that? Was it survey data you were looking at?
Yeah, it's a national survey of American adults, and so we have really good measures of religion. So at the same time we're assessing Christian nationalism, we're also looking at religious affiliation, which specific religion you affiliate with, how much you practice, so how much you attend religious services, how much you pray, biblical literalism, which is kind of a standard measure in the social religion and views of the Bible, and incorporating all those things as well as controlling for political identity and socio-demographics. Christian nationalism is the most important religious predictor. The most important predictors overall of voting for Trump are party ID, which is not surprising, then a measure of what's basically xenophobia, a fear of immigrants, and then Christian nationalism is a close third. And that paper's under review right now. So it'll probably be out in the next year or so. But the Christian nationalism thing is a very influential idea politically, and it's not going away. I'd say that. So just because history itself doesn't support the idea, doesn't mean that people don't believe it and act on it.
Yeah, this actually goes to something that you mentioned, I think, towards the end of American secularism, when I believe you talk about the case in Ireland, where during the Troubles,
Yeah.
and the link between religion and nationalism. Can you explain a little bit about that, and then we can go into why I'm thinking about this connection?
Sure. Well, we used it as a comparison um, to say that so people hold up Western Europe as a more secular region, and Ireland and Northern Ireland have long been something of an exception to levels of secularity in Europe. And people point to the political conflict and the salience of religion in the political conflict as part of the reason. The joke is that you can be an atheist, but you have to be a Catholic or a Protestant atheist. So you still have to pick sides in sort of the political conflict. We used it to try to talk about how for at least the period from the 1950s until really the 90s, the external threat to the United States was perceived to be communism and godless communism in it, and sort of secularity was linked to communism. And so there was this external enemy that was associated with secularity. And during this time, secularity among the populace is low. If you look at opinion surveys and things like that, people are very low levels of people say they either have no religion or that they're atheist, etc. As that perceived threat, began to wane, and it switched to other external threats, Islam or things like that, the level of people claiming secularity in the population rose. So part of the argument there was that part of what might have been keeping secularity down was this external threat and its link to secularity in rhetoric and politics. And you can look at explicitly, if you look at like McCarthyism and things like that, where there's very serious consequences for being secular. And then, as you move toward the end of that era in the 70s and 80s, the price or the cost might be less, but there's still a strong stigma associated with it. But as that wanes, it opens up more space for people to claim secularity. So we were making the comparison to Ireland to say that you've always got to look at political conflict and it's linked to religious identity to try to get some sense of kind of like how things will fall out.
Yeah, so to bring this back to the Trump survey, do you think that what might be happening there is there is this perception of external threats that was driving Christian nationalist support for Trump?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Christian nationalism has strong links to other types of ideologies. So, for instance, I talked about the xenophobia ideology. It's strongly related to Christian nationalism. Now, they're not the same. Think of them as kind of like, it's like a Venn diagram. There's some overlap, but there's some distinction. So you can be one without the other, but many people are both. And the Christian nationalism idea, if you look at it historically, going through all the 20th century, usually it's claimed as a way to exclude people who are seen as racially or ethnically other. So like, the rise of the Klan in the 1920s to the 1940s, they are sort of latching on to this idea of Christian nationalism, and to them that meant kicking out the Catholics, which is kind of ironic given that it's sort of the original Christian church, right? But it's like this idea has a link to sort of kicking out the immigrants. And so there's Christian nationalism and sort of ethnocentrism and xenophobia are all sort of interwoven. So I think there's definitely an element of that to it. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who would consider themselves evangelical. And if you ask them questions explicitly about racial and ethnic animus or dislike of certain groups, they wouldn't come out as being overtly racist. But at the same time, they would come out as being high on the Christian nationalism scale. So it almost works as a way to activate people's latent racial or ethnic fears without explicitly saying, hey, be a racist. Right. And so it's almost like, it's not quite a dog whistle, but it's a little more of like an indirect play. And it's very effective, and some politicians use it better than others. And we argue that this is how Trump secured a large portion of the religious vote, because before the election, people were really saying, well, he's this, thrice married New Yorker who, doesn't seem to care about personal morality. Will religious people vote for him? Blah, blah, blah. But when you actually got to the polls, they voted for him at the same rates they voted for Mitt Romney, who was very pious, although Mormon. But so there didn't seem to be any slack off in the religious vote. And we argue that largely what he did is he activated the Christian nationalism strain of this as sort of the motivating factor.
I see. Okay, well, that's very interesting. We'll look forward to that paper. to
let's hope it comes out sooner than later.
Yeah. To kind of, I guess, back up a little bit. What
I know I got off track there.
Yeah, well, that's totally fine. It's what we do. What do people mean when they say that they're secular?
Well, different people mean different things. And so we include as sort of in this large umbrella. So this idea of non-religion as an umbrella category, we include in that people who would say explicitly, I'm an atheist, or I don't believe in God. People who would say explicitly, I'm an agnostic, or, I don't know if there's a God and I don't know if you can find out, kind of like the sort of the identity version and the belief version. And then we also include people who say, if we say, what's your religion? And they say, no religion. But then if you ask a theism question, they say yes. They say some form of theism. So we call those people non-affiliated believers. So we include all of them in this sort of the secular category, because the last group is explicitly saying, I have no religion. And that's important, but it's also important to realize that that category sort of straddles the line between religion and secularity, because you're kind of half in, half out, right? So you're organized religion, you're out. But on the supernaturalism, you're still accepting parts of what would be considered traditional religious views. So if you imagine that as a continuum, you could kind of have your firm atheist over here as sort of like fully secular or something to that effect. And then you could have non-affiliated belief as kind of the in-between category before you move back over to religion. So what we're arguing is that we should study all three of those groups fairly intently and in depth, and that they all warrant their own study. Some people try to slice out different parts inside of those, so they'll say, let's look at the spiritual but not religious, and those people tend to be concentrated in the non-affiliated believer group. And I'm all for all of that stuff, but we basically include people if they said, I have no religion on an affiliation question, or if they said either I'm an atheist or an agnostic. And it deserves note that you can be an affiliated non-theist. So that's quite possible, right? I could be a Jewish atheist or something like that.
And that would be what some people sometimes call culturally religious, or,
Right.
I do think actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they tends to be very high levels of that in Judaism, right?
Correct. So there are higher levels of that in Judaism, and there's some affinity with the ethnic marker, sort of maintaining sort of family connections. But you might say, well, sure, my family's Jewish and I'm Jewish, but I don't believe in God. And that makes total sense in some ways, that the part of the religious beliefs don't make sense to you, but the cultural part does. Or you could be someone who still finds meaning in the ritual, even though you don't necessarily believe in supernaturalism. Or if we want to move it outside of the example of Judaism, the Unitarians explicitly say you can be an atheist and agnostic and come here. And so in those cases, people may be non-theists, but religiously affiliated and maybe actually active, and going to their congregation. So we allow for that sort of diversity to happen. We don't push those people out. Like if you say, I'm an agnostic, but I still affiliate, then we don't say, okay, you're religious. We still include it as part of our study. But those things actually deserve attention on their own. A specified study of affiliated non-theists is worth doing.
Right. So I don't think it will come as any surprise to people listening that the rate of secularism seems to have been increasing in the United States over the past, I'm not exactly sure the time frame, but certainly over the past 10 years.
Since 1990 is when the uptick goes.
Okay. And what do you see as driving that trend?
Short answer, politics. But also different views of organized religion across generations. And those two things are related. So let me back up and say that. To give the description of the increase, the General Social Survey started in 1973. They've asked the same question about religion since they started, which is, what is your religious preference? And then they give you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, other, and you can fill in what other, and none. So they've asked the question the same way. When they started in the 70s, they would get 6 to 7% of Americans who said none. And that was pretty stable until 1990. It was still 7%. So in a lot of ways, if you take a snapshot of the U.S. from early 70s to right at 1990, it looks like basic stability. But then in 91, the percentage saying no religion starts to go up. And it continues to go up pretty steadily from 91 until the present day, till the point where now latest surveys will say 24% of Americans say they have no religion. Now, I'm a sociologist of religion, and that is a radical transformation of a religious marketplace, if you want to call it that, in a short amount of time. To have the percentage of people who say they have no religion triple in 20 years is fairly astounding. So then, okay, what's happening? And we try to pull that apart. And one of the main things is that most of those people are not atheist or agnostic. Most of them fall into that other category, the non-affiliated believer. They're saying none, but they're maintaining some type of theism. So that's one thing, is that it's not all moving into what we typically think of as your standard sort of secular individual. They're kind of in between mostly.
They're leaving organized religion more than becoming atheist.
Correct. So that's the distinction, actually, is that it's a reaction against organized religion, but not necessarily a decline in supernaturalism. So atheism, agnosticism combined have increased a little bit. So there is a little bit of uptick there. And some people say that that'll go up in the future, and that's possible, but we'll wait and see. But for the most part, it seems to be mainly a reaction against organized religion. And so what's going on there? Well, if you look at what has happened in the 1980s, the sort of the GOP in some sense captured the kind of the Protestant right, the rise of the religious right. So you can look at Falwell and the moral majority, and you had this movement of conservative Protestantism, which used to be fairly evenly distributed between Republican and Democrat. And part of this is a transition of the solid Democratic South to the solid Republican South. So a lot of those Southern evangelicals are moving from, Democrat to Republican. But as that period of consolidation occurred from 1979 to the early 90s, as that occurred, then afterwards there was sort of a reaction by moderates and liberals. So people who might have been nominally religious before and said, I'm culturally Catholic or something, now might look at sort of what religion is, and its political meaning has changed. And so on TV and hearing people talk about it, you hear like, to be religious is to be against gay marriage and anti-abortion, and to be all these things. And people would look at that and think, well, that's not me. If that's what it means to be religious, then I'm not religious. Yeah. Right. So in some sense, it's people who probably weren't deeply embedded to begin with, and so there's kind of a move away from it, as it's like, that doesn't represent me. And then you also have the children of people from that era growing up who have radically different views of specifically sexuality, and also things like premarital sex, same-sex relations, and also things like pot use. And so younger generations are liberal on that stuff, and it does not jive with the religious right. And so even kids who are raised inside of the religious right, once they come of age, are more likely to drop out. And so what's driving the uptick is a rise in what we call the apostasy rate, which might be, we don't mean it pejoratively. It doesn't sound great, I guess, is what is. One of my colleagues says, one person's apostate is another person's convert. But we mean it in the sense of you were raised inside of a religious tradition and then you dropped out. And so that has been on the increase. And that is what's driving that uptick. And primarily the people who are dropping out are political moderates and liberals, and especially people of younger generations. So if you look at people under 35, the percent saying they have no religion is up around a third or higher. And so that's so we sort of make the answer that it's politics, and then it's also generational sort of shifts in attitudes about morality. Mm-hmm. And that those two things are obviously connected, and that is the main driver that's kind of like led to this transition.
What are some of the demographic traits associated with strong religious belief or a strong affiliation? There's a few different ones. So women are more likely to be religious, of various varieties, basically however you measure it, whether it's belief
or practice. In the U.S., ethnic minorities are more likely to be religious, especially African Americans, but also Hispanic Americans. So there's some demographic patterns there. There's an interesting dynamic with education where higher education makes you more likely to be involved with a religious organization. It also tends to drive down supernaturalism. So there's a countervailing effect there, where, like, for instance, a college degree makes you more likely to be a non-theist, and it simultaneously makes you more likely to attend religious services. So it's doing both of those things at the same time.
That surprises me. I
Well,
can't
so
think of an explanation for that. Why do you have?
Here's the explanation as best I could give one: is that higher education makes you more likely to be civically engaged in all types of civic organizations, including religious organizations. So you're more likely to vote. You're more likely to be a member of the PTA. You're also more likely to be a member of a religious organization. Now, you may quietly be an agnostic while being a member of that religious organization. But so education has these kind of countervailing effects on that. There is a definitive age pattern to religiosity. Older people are more religious. So, and there's some life cycle patterns there where people are more likely to drop out in 20s and 30s, come back in midlife, and then especially late life, there are much higher rates of religiosity there. So those are kind of the standard ones. And now in the U.S., this is not a demographic factor, but political identity. Conservatives are much more religious, and liberals are much less likely to be pious in sort of the traditional sense. And so those are some basic ones.
Yeah, and you would attribute that liberal conservative religious split to the way that the Conservative Party has used religion in politics. What's the so-called God strategy, right?
Correct. Yeah, and if you read that book, that is a fabulous book, The God Strategy.
I haven't read it, but
great book. It's about political rhetoric and sort of the use of political rhetoric about religion, and it's about the GOP and sort of using that language. But so we can actually test this. If I can take surveys from the 50s and 60s, and if I have a measure of political identity, it's basically uncorrelated with service attendance, how often you go to religious services. But now it's strongly correlated with religious service attendance. And with the GSS, you can actually watch this correlation go up over time. So it's not an inevitable consequence. It is instead an outcome of a political strategy and political realignment. So it's not as if inevitably conservatives are more religious. It's an outcome of sort of the political machinations and strategies.
Now, a few of the most high-profile secularists in recent years, the new atheists. These are strongly militantly atheists, as they're sometimes described. People like Chris Hitchens, or now Lawrence Krauss, I think, although I think he objects to the term himself, is sometimes lumped in with them.
Dawkins and Dennett.
Yeah. Do you think that? Well, what do you think their effect on secularism, if any, has been?
Well, there's a couple things there. I mean, certainly a lot of individuals do cite reading those texts as important in their own sort of conversion to non-theism, if you want to call it that, or their transition to non-theism. So, and they've sold millions of books, for sure. And it's fair to say, I think, that, as you're saying, they're probably the most prominent public faces of secularism. And so, in some ways, they've kind of put secularism more in the public sphere, so there's more visibility for it. So those are at least quasi-positive things. But to give a negative thing, I think there is also now sort of this perception, and it's always been there in some ways. The Dawkins style only reinforces it for people who already believe this, but to assume that, atheists are the angry atheists, they hate all religious people, and they don't, they're as prejudiced as anybody. And so I think while at the same time it's been liberating for some people who have read those and found them to be insightful, that at the same time it has not done any favors with trying to quell anti-atheist prejudice, which is a very real thing, right? I mean, this is, if you look at, again, in the U.S. surveys, groups who people say they dislike, atheists are at the top. It used to be that they were at the top alone, but now they're at the top relatively equally with Islam. But anti-atheist prejudice is a real thing, and I don't think people like Dawkins I don't think they lessen that to any degree, because if I'm a religious person and I look at that and listen to that rhetoric, I just kind of say, oh, well, it's what I thought it was. It's just they're just anti-religious and they think we're all stupid. And so in one way, you can see it as being beneficial for people and liberating for people who read it and feel like, okay, look, I'm not alone. There's somebody else who sees the world in this naturalistic way, and I can find my way in this. And so you can see the benefit there. And but on the public level, I don't think the way they go about it is the best strategy for secularists to have a public voice. Now, people differ in this, because the sort of the quote-unquote militant part of the movement would say, no, we have to oppose superstition in all its forms and things like that. And I tend to come at it from a little bit more of a coalition reform type thing, where it's like, look, if there are liberal religious groups or groups who are in line with us on some particular issue, then we should work with them, right? I mean, like, there should be a coalition. I mean, just because someone believes in the supernatural is no reason for me not to partner with them if we both believe in economic and racial justice. And so, but part of that's just a matter of strategy and things like that. So I'm of two minds about it. One is that, having done interviews with people, you see lots of instances where people say it's been very positive for them. So you can see that part of it. But then on the public discourse part, I don't think it's removing anybody's stereotypes about what an atheist is.
Yeah. Now, the sort of coalition approach to secularism in society that you mentioned, that's interesting. That's something that I think Unitarian Universalists have very much been pushing, even having on their website things like Atheists Welcome.
Yeah.
How's that working out for them?
Actually, quite well. In this sense, okay, so liberal Protestant groups, so Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, the PCUSA, which are like the liberal Presbyterians, those groups are all fairly liberal on a lot of social and economic justice issues, and a lot of times on gender and sexuality issues too. At the same time, the numbers of all those groups have been rapidly declining for the last 30 or 40 years. They've been hollowed out, and I could, I work at the data archive. I can show you the numbers on these denominations. They're losing members. The UU are actually growing. So in some sense, they are staving off the decline that is hurting other liberal religious groups. I think through two things: by having a more inclusive approach that says, Buddhists, fine, you can have a home here. Atheists, we're cool with that. You know what I mean? We're not going to hate on you if that's how you feel. And so they've sort of been a little more welcoming, and it's a larger tent than you might get in other liberal religions that still rely on supernaturalism and sort of traditional Protestantism or something. And the other thing that they've done positively is they have really high levels of civic engagement. So people who attend UU congregations tend to be involved in the community. They tend to volunteer for things. They vote. They serve at soup kitchens. And so the UUs have been successful with having kind of this coalition approach and also pushing civic engagement to say that, like, liberal religion, if you want to call it that, or liberal philosophy or whatever, does not mean that you just get to sit at home and feel, good about yourself. We expect you to go do something. And so if you compare them to other groups who have similar political views, they've done better, they've fared better than the groups who are staying within traditional Protestantism while trying to combine it with some form of liberalism. Now, I mean, there's still a fairly small group overall in terms of like total population or something, but I mean, it's So I gave a, quote unquote sermon for a UU congregation around here, and I showed them some numbers on this to say, look, these other groups are declining, and you're doing fairly well. And of course, they were happy to see that. But I think a lot of it has to do with the combination of the coalition approach, but also asking something of people, right? To say that, like, civic engagement is the way to go. It's what we believe in.
And getting a commitment, once people feel committed to a cause through actual action, it's easier to bring them together as a community.
Yeah, and so as a sociologist of religion, the liberal Protestant groups all have what we call, in economics, you'd call the free rider problem, which is like, if I want to show up on Easter and Christmas, then I will. I know the Episcopals will still be here, and they'll have the ritual and everything, but they're not going to come knocking on my door and be like, where have you been? So they tend to have this thing where they don't require a lot of people to participate. And it's not that UUs explicitly say you have to volunteer 7 times or something, but there is a culture of activism and a culture of engagement that says, look, if you're going to be in this group, this is what we're all going to be doing, And so I feel like they've been, and numbers show this, they've been more successful at trying to stay engaged and have, in a liberal group, their members engaged, whereas other liberal groups tend to be sort of plagued with weak members.
Have you looked at how any of these explicitly secular or atheist kinds of groups have been faring? Things like Sunday Assembly, although they have varying degrees of atheism, or Oasis, I think, is another one. Some of these so-called secular churches.
Secular churches are a specific. So we looked at some nonprofit groups, so Secular Student Association and things like that. Now those groups are all growing. They're growing quite rapidly. Now the Sunday Assembly is specific. It's, again, as you say, atheist church or whatever you want to call it. And that I know less about, but a friend of mine at the University of Minnesota is a grad student there, and she's doing her dissertation. It's an ethnography of the Sunday Assembly, Jackie Frost at Minnesota. So I assume hopefully that'll be a book in the next few years, and I've seen her work on that. So it's really interesting in terms of how people are trying to form community and what's kind of a quasi, congregational model, but also sort of removing some of the traditional sort of structures of church and things like that. So most of those groups are, like Secular Student Association is thriving. It's fair to say that. Sunday Assembly, I don't know their numbers, so in terms of like, are they growing, I'm not really sure. They seem to be sustaining fairly well. And perhaps they're growing. I just don't know right offhand on that. But most secular organizations are doing well. And I would say better than if they were around 10 or 15 years ago, better now than they were then. And so we profile like American Humanist Association, and that's true for them. And so on the whole, they're doing well. But again, the biggest share of these people dropping out aren't explicitly saying I'm an atheist. So the biggest share of these people in the population are not affiliating with these groups.
Right.
So they are growing, but at the same time, there's a large pool of people who are outside of organizations now.
So it seems like there may be an increasing acceptance of non-believers in the U.S. Do you think that is true in the future? Like, is that the way the trends are moving?
Barely. Yes. So again, GSS has asked questions like, would you be okay if an atheist taught at college? Would you be okay if an atheist had their book in the library? And those things have been trending towards less prejudice, but not in a dramatic way. So in a mild way. But I would say this, the more that people are open about being non-religious, which is certainly more prevalent now than it used to be, we would expect some of those prejudices to lessen just by virtue of contact theory. So just like people coming out as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender has served in some ways to lessen that stigma, if you look at public opinion polls, because people now say, instead of thinking, oh, I hate gay people, they think, oh, well, I know this person, and they're actually a really good person, and, they're good to their partner, and blah, blah, blah. It sort of removes the ability to other somebody without thinking about it. So to the extent that more people are open about it, and by virtue of that, more people know someone who's non-religious, and hopefully for the most part, they think of those people as saying, well, they're still good, upstanding citizens and things like that. That should lessen the prejudice. And there has been evidence of that in other countries where there's higher levels of secularity. So it's trending that way, but my caveat is that it's not trending in a really fast way, at least yet. But if more people are open about being outside of religion, I think you'll see some of that.
Okay. Just before we wrap up here, have you looked, or do you know of research that's looked at countries where there's been forced atheism, forced secularism? I'm thinking of like China, for instance. What's sort of the situation there? Are they crypto-religious, or does the secularism actually take? Do you find higher levels of self-professed secularism?
You do find higher levels of self-professed secularism, but religion persists. So there is good research on China. Fenggang Yang is the leading scholar on that. He talks about, I think he calls them red, gray, and some other religious markets. So there's kind of like some religions that you can do publicly, others are underground. But they've not been successful at driving out religion totally. The stuff I'm more familiar with, one of my mentors has done a lot of research on Russia, and he's got a great book called The Plot to Kill God, about sort of how the Russian Revolution was essentially tried to extinguish religion, and theism with it, and how those efforts largely, in the long run, were not successful, despite a continued and, in some instances, sort of horrific and tyrannical effort to do so. And once those restrictions were lifted, religion came back, almost like you had covered this garden and suddenly showed it the sunlight, and then it's like all the stuff just flowers. Now, interestingly, Putin now is trying to co-opt the Orthodox Church, and has done so reasonably successly, which, as Paul, my mentor, argues, is frankly what they should have done to begin with. Don't kill it, take it over, if we're thinking strategically. But yeah, so efforts at forced secularization, you do end up, if you're looking at opinion surveys, so if you look at percentage of people who believe in God, it'll be lower in Russia, China, former communist countries. It will be lower. But there's also still a considerable amount of traditional religion, new age forms of religion. It's like, to me, it's one of those things that you can't kill it. You can push it underground, but it'll find a way to persist. And people, if they want to believe in something or want to do something, they will sustain it. And so, forced secularization, frankly, you're better off, if you want a secular country, you're better off, the way to do it is to have good social safety net and have high levels of what we would call existential security, which means you have access to education, health, social services, the basic needs. And so the places that are higher in those are where you find the highest levels of secularity. So if you look at Scandinavian countries, that's where you find the highest level of non-theism. So if you're imagining that you're some, ruler and your goal is secularity, then you should like social security and public education. You know what I mean? Forget trying to kill the church.
Right. There is the idea that when you're in a country, when you're living a life where your basic needs are not met, or it's always a struggle, and there's desperate poverty around you, you need religion, you need faith, that there's supernatural power looking out for you, there's comfort in that kind of belief. So that makes sense that in countries that provide stable living situation, you're going to have higher rates of secularity.
Yeah, and analyses at the spatial level bear this out. So, like, for instance, just as a quant nerd, the highest correlation I could get at the country level is if I go infant mortality, belief in God. So the more like life is in threat, the higher you expect theism to be. And this holds across countries globally, and it holds inside of regions too. So if I split the U.S. up by county or by state, and I look at levels of poverty and, sort of death and despair, it correlates with theism and religiosity. So that basic association holds, pretty well across different regions. Now, it's not a perfect thing. It's not as if you have perfect existential security, quote unquote, because you can't have it, you will die, right? Yes. So it's like, no matter what, you are not going to have perfect existential security. So on some level, there's always a need for it there, or there's always that level of it. And it's also not as if people in secure countries, or secure places, they're all secular. Some of them are still religious. And so there's some variation. But if you think of it as averages, there's a huge difference between places where I might die today, and that's every day, versus places where I'm pretty secure. I know that if something happens to me, I've got access to health care, and I know that I'm well taken care of. And so there are vast differences in population rates of religiosity in those places.
Yeah. So, last question. What are you currently working on? What's next for you?
We are like 80% done with a book that I am lovingly calling Sex, Drugs, and Bigfoot.
It's a good title.
And here's the short of it. Allow me to sell you. If that didn't sell you on it, allow me to sell you on it. It's basically, we're outlining a relatively parsimonious theory of deviance management, by which we mean if you do something that is stigmatized by those around you, how do you cope with it? And you've got there's a few different options. If it's hideable, I can hide. All right. So you can apply this to the example of secularism. If I'm an atheist, nobody has to know unless I tell them. So I can pass. You know what I mean? Like, I just won't talk about it, and it won't be a problem for me. So you can hide. That's a strategy, a coping strategy. Another coping strategy is to subset, to create a subculture. I'm going to go join the atheist group, and I'm only going to be around people who are like me. That way I don't have to deal with religious people. And so people who stigmatize me, they reject me, so I reject them. And so I build my social networks around the subculture. A third option, though, is normalizing, where I say, no, like, I'm an open atheist, and I'm going to tell people about it. And if they want to stigmatize me, then I'm going to try to explain to them why they should not. And so that's more of a direct engagement. So now what we do is we take we kind of come up with this strategy or this theory about who will use what strategy under what circumstance. And then we try to apply it to 3 different subcultures. One is paranormalism, and it's got a heavy emphasis on the Sasquatch on this one, because we have lots of field work with some different types of Bigfoot groups. Some who say, it's an undiscovered animal, we're scientists just like you. And some who say, no, it's a psychic Sasquatch, and I've had communication with the spirit brothers, and they have, brought me this form of enlightenment. And those are kind of like the normalizing strategy and the outsider strategy, respectively. We have survey data, and we have field work on that. Then we look at sexual and gender minorities. So anybody who says I'm LGBTQ, and we look at specifically outsider strategies of queer movements there, where they're trying to say, we don't, why do we want to be part of gay marriage? Marriage is a patriarchal institution. You got to fight the power. Versus kind of an assimilationist strategy that says, we're just like you, we're family just like you. And so it's kind of the normalizing pattern. And the theory we come up with holds pretty well about who will pick what strategy, who will have what view. And then the last one we look at is views of alcohol use, and specifically the repeal of prohibition in the United States as an analog to contemporary moves to normalize marijuana use. So basically it's like we have this theory, we lay out the theory in a few chapters, and then it's like application chapters, where does it apply in this circumstance? How does it apply in this circumstance? It's a bit of a weird one because it's substantively kind of all over the map. But the theory is pretty concise. And so it's basically a theory book that's trying to do some application to show that, we're not just making this up and that it holds under these different circumstances.
Right. There's actually a advantage to having such different circumstances because it means the theory applies more widely.
Correct. And it's more fun for us in the sense that I don't have to keep doing the same thing over and over for 10 years, which is frankly what I did for the Secularism book. It was like all secularism all the time. And now it's like, okay, I can do the paranormalism thing for a bit and then we can shift gears and I can, do some historical work on the repeal of prohibition. And it keeps me from getting bored.
Well, that's always a good goal. That's a good goal to have. Well, listen, thanks so much. For anyone who is scrambling to go pick up a copy of American Secularism after this, this is the book here. There's a lot of data in it. It's very interesting. I would recommend it to anyone. And thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
You too.